We're so glad you could join us for this first Trinity Forum online conversation on the remarkable Dorothy Day, joined by the remarkable Anne Snyder. We think this will really be a fascinating conversation, and we're so glad that you're here. This is really a new venture for us. Those of you who have been familiar with the Trinity Forum know that we try to provide a space and resources for the best of Christian thought leadership and to engage the big questions of life in the context of faith. But we've also believed that as embodied beings, meeting in person is very important. We've sought to connect leading thinkers with thinking leaders. And so we, along with many other organizations, are essentially experimenting in these unusual and uncertain times with trying to find new ways to bring about connections between our friends and neighbors, as well as to encourage people to stay part of the great conversation about the big questions of life and the author of the answers. And this online conversation is our first attempt to do that. So we really welcome your thoughts. There'll be an opportunity to fill out a survey at the very end of our conversation today, and would love to have your feedback in helping us continue to further enhance these kind of opportunities to connect with you and to offer a platform for the best of Christian thought. I'm really delighted today to be joined by my friend Anne Snyder, a Trinity Forum Senior Fellow, the editor-in-chief of Comment Magazine, and I think one of the most remarkable thinkers and writers around in the intersection of culture, faith, politics, and beauty. And so it's just a real pleasure to have you here today, Anne. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Cherie. It's a bright spot in my week.
Oh, well, we're really delighted to have you. I should add just one note about what will lie ahead today. We will have this conversation last for around an hour. We were really excited by how many people have joined us. And so we're going to try to use our technology to make sure that as many of your questions as possible are heard. And so if you have a question, please use the Q&A box in the middle of your lower toolbar there to submit a question for Anne. We are expecting over 200 people to be joining us, so it is likely we will not get to everyone's question, but we'll do what we can. And in addition, throughout the program, there will be a chat box on the right-hand side of your screen where you can add where you're from and where my colleagues will be adding different resources and the like that may be helpful to you. But onward. So we've gathered here today to discuss one of our Trinity Forum readings, The Long Loneliness, which many of you may have read and have a copy of. And of course, The Long Loneliness was brilliantly introduced by our guest today, Anne Snyder, along with her husband, New York Times columnist David Brooks. So Anne, thanks for coming today and for sharing some of your thoughts on Dorothy Day.
Sure.
So it seems like Dorothy Day has sort of captured your interest and imagination for quite some time. What intrigued you about her life and her story?
Yeah, well, I discovered Dorothy Day in about, I want to say it was like 2012, 2013. And I started with The Long Loneliness, and there was just something immediately relatable and at the same time inspiring about her. And first there was just sort of her personality, which just shoots through her very deft, but also direct and honest prose. She had this just unusually dramatic trajectory of a life that swung radically from a certain kind of atheist, bohemian set of convictions and freedoms to then a much more kind of cost-heavy, cost-filled surrender and life poured out that wound up not only touching a lot of lives, both those responding to profound need as well as those in desperate need. But she, in touching many lives, she also just created a social movement and set of institutions, namely a newspaper that we now know as the Catholic Worker, and a nationwide kind of ecosystem of hospitality houses that live on to this day. So I think her kind of rare pairing of personalism and yet a learned realism around the need to build institutions in the name of justice and mercy just really intrigued me. She's drawn to extremes, like you read her writing and you see like just deep sort of passion that sometimes goes in opposite and often conflicting directions. And I think, we can talk about that later, but there was something about her sort of split self almost the ways in which she was attracted to extremes of ideology, extremes of people, while also eventually, especially when she came to Christian faith, trying to submerge all that and merge those extremes into a unity and integration that just like I deeply identified with. Like friends have always joked that there's like I'm always seeking this like unity amidst plurality, sometimes in almost this like mystical, invisible way that not everyone always understands. So she just made me feel less alone. And frankly, she's like very much a woman, and I'd never really had a hero before that I could sort of identify with vocationally in faith, but also she's from a different era, but she's still from the last, now a little over, she was born before 100 years ago, but the last century. And, there's sort of a feminine genius to Dorothy in the ways in which she was very concrete and incarnational in how she saw reality and political issues. She really didn't have any patience for abstractions, which I think can be a bit of a sort of a female impatience. I say that as a philosophy major who was one of the lone women in her major, just wanting to draw things down to earth. And I think I resonate with that obviously as a woman, and she kind of was a model for me of what it meant to be a modern woman who was also used that part of herself to be a public consequence. And then just finally, more personally, I discovered her in a time of my life when I was struggling to make sense of like a growing sense of calling to individual complexity, to the grassroots, to stories that just weren't getting heard or covered, to subtleties inherent in real people, real communities, less political issues and abstractions and statistics. And yet at the time, I found myself working within a kind of an elite media corridor that seemed only willing to cover reality from either a top-down, don't get offended by this, Miss Harvard grad, but sort of a only Ivy League perspective of reality, or an ideological one. And I was kind of in that world and very frustrated by it, found it very limiting. And Dorothy Day refused all this. She refused to be distant from those she was serving and those she was describing in her newspaper. And she just was eventually able to pair like her journalistic craft with her faith, with in her case, a deep commitment to the poor that it was just a trio, an integrated trio that became a much needed lighthouse for my own journey in living and leading and writing.
I love that. I'd love for you to elaborate a little bit on her own spiritual journey. As you well know, Dorothy Day is currently being considered for sainthood. She's a candidate for canonization, is probably one of the more unlikely candidates for canonization, and probably the first to have both had a child out of wedlock, but in prison for activism and have had an abortion. So an unlikely saint, and not a paper saint at all, but very earthy. And I thought it was interesting, Pope Benedict actually used her conversion story as an example of how to journey towards faith in a secularized environment. So I'd love your thoughts about what sort of started her spiritual journey and how she found herself from a largely atheistic activist who was nevertheless haunted by God to a candidate for sainthood.
Well, I'll do the best that I can. I mean, I think she talks about like very young. She was like 6 or 7 years old when what we now think of as a pretty famous earthquake struck San Francisco, where she was living with her family, and it just kind of disrupted her whole universe. There's a very evocative scene where she talks about her mother grabbing her siblings and her dad grabbing someone else, and she's left alone in her own bed as it's rocking back and forth across the shaking floor. And I think that was a disruption, like any kid, and frankly, it's a little resonant with our current moment. Any kid that sort of sees that like utter shaking of reality as you know it, I think you're just suddenly, your innocence is a little bit taken away, and the sense of all order being bent towards the good is disrupted. So that was also paired with, she immediately saw an incredible solidarity around her, and in the city, people helping one another in ways that hadn't been true prior to the disaster. Neighbors reaching out across classes. And I think she saw this solidarity that years later she would probably be almost a flavor in her own attractions that she found embodied in the Catholic Church and in Catholic social teaching. So that's sort of like a beginning. And she talks about even then somehow always being haunted by a religious sense, being haunted by God, as you said. And then, you know, she wound up after that experience seeing this solidarity, and I think she wouldn't have said it at the time, but maybe noticing God's love itself working out in human self-sacrifice for the other. She just started reading really widely, and she was drawn once again to sort of radical thinkers. So she started reading a lot of anarchists, and she, I'm trying to find the quote here, but says there was something in their framing of, there was sort of the visibility and tangibility of how human beings could carry one another. I think became her, she was more drawn to that than she was to a lot of Christian piety. So there was a period of time where she just like really reacted against any kind of divine reference. She was like, well, none of those people seem to be helping in the way that the world needs. And had sort of these wild years. She fell into a writerly crowd eventually in New York, and sort of allowed her passions to take her from there. And I think in all of that, there was always a deep longing for human connection that she would wind up describing as a deep longing for a divine connection. I sped it up there a lot. It's much more complex than that, but.
You mentioned earlier her longing for integration, which I thought was really interesting. And your introduction to the reading describes some of the polarized extremes that she seemed to embody. Both the asceticism and the sensuality, the revolution and the gratitude, the earthy and the mystical. How did she transition or work her way from a life of really polarized extremes to one of integration?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I'm not sure. You know, someone like her granddaughter and some of her family members would probably answer this best, but my reading of her is, I'm not sure she ever completely transitioned. I think there was always a tension. She was, and especially as she got older, in fact, more and more as she aged, she would say, like, I just grew more and more dependent upon God. But so she was always like, after she became a Christian, she was very grounded in a very disciplined life of daily prayer and the sacraments, and these became almost more fundamental to her than food and water. So there was like a commitment to being singularly focused, singularly surrendered to God, how that would work itself out in her service to the poor. And sort of that there, in all of her sort of mystical complexity, there was a way to make sense of it just in serving the proximate, serving what was right in front of you. Love had to be lived, however inconvenient, however imperfect and prosaic. But I think, and I'm gonna have trouble expressing this very clearly, it makes sense to me, but I don't know if it's easy to translate. There's something in kind of almost her inherent, she was almost like she was born with this sort of attraction to purities that can exist in our ideological poles. In her lifetime, sort of as a 20-something, she was very drawn to sort of a communist sense of justice and social order. And then she became Catholic, which had obviously no room for communism. She was drawn deeply to nature and to the peace of the sea. But she was also felt a deep conviction to be among the masses of people and to be among the swell and even the chaos of that. Revolution and civil disobedience on the one hand, but also radical obedience to God as she discerned his will in her life. And in all of this, there was, I think, what unites these seemingly disparate sort of trajectories was just like an unending quest for truth and a deep quest for divine and right order wherever she would find it. And she felt them purely and pursued them purely, even if the categories didn't quite make sense to the world, didn't make sense to the political categories of the day. But somehow I think she trusted that through prayer and faith, God could somehow make sense of it all. And there's the sort of the Annunciation moment in her own life. She'd been a Catholic for 5 years, a relatively new mother, trying to balance that with sort of her writing was not really going super well. She was still hanging out with her communist friends, and she marched in this sort of march against hunger in Washington and was just sort of disenchanted with the crowd, didn't think that they had quite the right understanding of justice. It was a very sort of pagan power notion of powers being subverted, and she was just really dissatisfied. So kind of in a last spent desperate plea, she kind of fled the march to, in Northeast Washington, D.C., the National Shrine, the Basilica up there, and just prayed this prayer, you know, God, please integrate these aspects of my life. Like, I love your poor and I love your church, but at the time your church seems very power and hierarchical. You know, make sense of this for me. And so she kind of prayed that prayer in the crypt down below the sort of, there's a part, the massive basilica to this day still has what I consider a very scary Jesus who like looks like he does a lot of P90X, but below that is this very like sacred area that's very global. And it's really moving for anyone who lives in DC. It's just a beautiful place to go and pray and meditate. And she goes back up to New York City, and Peter, this guy named Peter Morin, was waiting in her kitchen, and he'd become familiar with Dorothy's writing in magazines that still exist to this day, Commonweal and America. And he had this idea for her, and at the time was a very radical idea that was marrying solidarity with journalism, voluntary poverty, and a workers' movement. And Dorothy was like, this is the exact, I could never have thought of this myself. This is the exact integration I was praying for. And she said yes. And then from there began the great adventure. So the bottom line is that I think so drawn to like truth and justice, and they're very partial and incomplete ways of sort of that were models in front of her. And somehow in a desperate prayer, she was like, there was a sense of grace being given to make it more complete with the categories she had in front of her.
Mm-hmm. So it goes without saying, Dorothy Day had what could be characterized as some colorful but deeply disappointing romantic relationships that seemed to sort of both punctuate and, you know, deeply color her life.
Yeah.
In addition, it seemed like the birth of her daughter was actually a really pivotal point in her journey to Catholicism. And I wondered if you could just comment on what impact you believe that essentially her relational and maternal life had on her spiritual journey.
Yeah. Well, again, not to relate everything to our current moment, but I've been thinking a lot about how crises, both intimate and macro and global, are like x-rays. They reveal things, right? And at least in my own life, really tough romantic breakups always reveal things about my own soul. So I'm assuming they did that for Dorothy too. At least if you're not gonna, you know, grow callous in the midst of the pain. And she was naturally a self-examiner, and I think her broken romantic relationships, sort of sometimes impetuous as they were, but deeply felt for her, as she describes in her writing, only furthered this kind of constant self-searching, sometimes in a way that led to a ton of shame, and then sometimes in a way that I think led her to prostrate herself before, you know, someone who could grant grace vertically. She was haunted by something more than her own moral calculus of herself and of other people. And I think, again, the sort of deep desire for intimacy and connection wound up leading her to God. And the great love of her life, who is the father of her daughter, Tamar, forced her, you know, the way she has both, you can read now like letters between them, as well as just the time they lived on this sort of on Staten Island on this beach, and they would just take these long walks. And he was a naturalist. He just taught her all these things about the granularity of the earth. And in that there was something about sort of the calm and peace and deep connection of that sort of relationship, almost outside of any other worldly construct. They were quite isolated, that he was an atheist, like committed atheist, that something about that love led her to feel more and more hungry for another love. Like it made sense within this more divine love, but he would have none of it. And when she did become pregnant with him and have her baby, and it's worth noting, this is the female part of her, she had noticed that all the accounts of childbirth had only ever been written by men. So she thought, you know, I think I should change that. So apparently like 40 minutes after the umbilical cord was cut, she wrote her own account of childbirth. And then in there, she says something like, she talks about the fire and pain and the earthquake of the experience of giving birth, and then just says, and then I held my daughter in my arms, and if I had composed the greatest symphony, painted the greatest painting, a variety of other superlatives, nothing could have given me the same sensation of love and adoration, and I needed someone or something to worship for this like deep sense of joy. So when you read her later work reflecting upon just her all these years of being haunted by God, and then what it was that kind of pushed her over the edge to sacrifice then like this deep love with Forster, it was just the sheer presence, the almost shocking presence of the joy of holding her own daughter. So there's a mystery there, but I think it's quite powerful when you read it, because it wasn't actually out of pain that she always said it was never pain that led me to God. It was just incredible joy that didn't make sense in my own, none of the categories I had made sense of this.
So let's talk a little bit about loneliness itself, since it's in the title. And you mentioned in the introduction that Dorothy's loneliness was of a particular sort. You know, she actually longed for solitude in many ways. Yeah. She was surrounded by people. There were lots of demands placed upon her and usually scant resources. What was the nature of the loneliness that she grappled with?
I think it's mysterious, but I think it was a few things. I've often thought that some of the holiest people I've known are also lonely. There's a deep loneliness about them, whether or not they're in religious life, whether or not they're married. And there's something there. And I think if you read scripture and you read about the saints, that's almost like part and parcel of like the long walk of faith, that there's a way in which you are set apart because there's a radical nature to your utter surrender. So I think that's just sort of a basic thing. Partly I think you can't totally separate her almost inchoate sense of loneliness from her romantic disappointments and her like deep break with Forster, which completely wrecked her heart, though she knew she felt she was doing the right thing to become Catholic, and he wouldn't join her, so that led to not totally permanent, but a separation. And I think there was something in sort of that loss, almost like the sort of lifelong then thorn in her side, that was never quenched, that was part of her loneliness. And I never have seen her, there have been some female saints who, like Teresa of Avila, whose like relationship with God almost has a romantic flavor, like an ecstasy. And I never see that with her. It's not like she channeled a lack of romantic love to God. It's more I think she gave that suffering and that ache up to him. And there was a wrestling in that. It was very, it was difficult for many of her time, and probably still to this day. There's a lot of controversy around Dorothy Day within Catholic circles, beyond Catholic circles. She scrambled a lot of categories around what justice meant, around what mercy meant, what it required. She didn't quite fit in with the elites because she was living with the poor. And yet she didn't, fit in with, at the time, certain intellectual leaders who were speaking about social justice because she believed in God. She was always sort of the odd one out. And some people say, like, on the edge of the inside of a variety of communities. And I think there was inherent loneliness there. People didn't fully understand her. And she never quite reconciled. As I said, she felt committed to being among the masses. That was part of why she was drawn to the Catholic Church, because she felt like of all the various parts of Christendom, the Catholic Church had everybody. And she was committed to serving them and walking amongst them and seeing God amongst them. And yet she was always craving time away at the sea, or even like the monastic life sort of romantically appealed to her. But every time she would try it, she realized she wasn't dispositionally fit for it. So in some ways, it was just never quite, you read her writing and there's just sort of a constant, her private journals, and which is at sort of sometimes at odds with her public persona, which I always find very direct and calm and just authentic. But in her private sort of self-examination, there's a lot of trying to understand herself. And I think there was something about that process that was intense and lonely, unaccompanied.
She closes The Long Loneliness with this beautiful sentence, which I'll just read, which is, We've all known the long loneliness, and we have learned that the only solution is love, and that love comes with community.
Mm-hmm.
And community is embodied, and all of us are now trying to make sense of a time where we, part of an expression of love to our neighbors is to socially distance ourselves from them, for the sake of their health and well-being. What are your thoughts on how Dorothy might have developed community
Right now,
in a time of social distancing?
I've actually been thinking a lot about that in the last few days, and I really don't know. I think it would have something to do. It would depend upon how old she was. I can imagine her being in her 70s or 60s, and all of her people, to say nothing of her daughter and grandchildren, whisking her away to the shore. She and Peter Morin and sort of the whole Catholic worker world had a farm in New York, and encouraging social isolation for the sake of service. And I can imagine her having like very journal entries full of consternation about this necessity, like probably a bunch of us are having. I've wondered, like, would she have, if she was younger, would she have tried to stay in New York and just continue doing what she was doing at great sacrifice to herself, but also great sacrifice to others? And I honestly don't know. I sort of don't think she would, because she was a realist and a pragmatist, but yeah, I mean, it's hard to know. She'd probably find some really creative way to do like virtual communion. I don't know if this will offend all my Catholic friends and the deep pain over like not being able to take the Eucharist right now, but we were more gathered even virtually. God is there among us. So she may not be that different from a lot of us, frankly, in this moment, but I could be wrong. She might choose to get arrested right now. I don't know.
Well, Annie, you will not be surprised to hear that there are already 35 different questions from our participants lined up for you. So we won't get through them all, but we'll try to handle and field as many as we can. So our first question comes from Mark Stewart, who says that in your introduction, you say her loneliness was not the alienation that we see today. Can you elaborate? And one thing I will just add to that is that it does seem to be like a remarkable difference between Dorothy's very passionate activism, which was also sort of amazingly tinged with gratitude, and marked far less by anger. So anyway, would love for you to elaborate on Mark's question.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I don't think she was existentially lonely and alienated like I sense so many are today. And I'm not even, well, maybe I am saying that a little bit like, maybe I'm saying that in the context of faith, lack of faith, but it's, she like threw herself into the like greatest inconveniences of constant crush of community. So, and it wasn't always fun. So there was this, when we talk about her loneliness, there's something it's more of like almost a moral and spiritual loneliness that was rooted in deep longing to sort of purify herself before God and so on. Whereas today, I think we're talking very much about like a horizontal people alienation and sort of the lack of consistent rootings that is just a product of 2020, product of the 21st century that was not as true in her day. And she, if anything, she was in a different time of societal disruption and actively seeking to respond to it by creating, her own social movement that was rooted in voluntary solidarity and so on. But there was not the same sense of rootlessness, lack of compass, scrambled social script that I think you see define a lot of the what we call alienation today. There's like a sense of just being one in a sea of who knows what the direction is, lack of larger narrative. And she did have a larger narrative. She was also in a cultural time that had a slightly clearer narrative and so on. So that's my attempt to answer that one.
So another question comes from Bob Freiling, who asks, Dorothy Day had a very strong sense of duty to the poor and even a duty to her baptism. She reminded me a bit of Mother Teresa, who also cared for the poor, but for years did not sense God's light in her own life. Someone has said that, quote, when love and duty are one, then grace is within you. Do you think Day experienced God's grace in her life? And if so, how?
I do think she did. I'm not sure she had quite the same constant desolation that Mother Teresa did, but she definitely had quite a few periods of not necessarily, I think, sensing that mystical communion. Um, her sequel to The Long Loneliness was called The Duty of Delight, which apparently was one of her favorite phrases. And I guess she said somewhere, she was thinking about titling it, that she said, I have this written down, I was thinking how as one gets older, we are tempted to sadness, knowing life as it is here on earth, the suffering, the cross, and how we must overcome it daily, growing in love and the joy which goes with loving. Yeah, I think, yeah, it's, I won't dare to compare her to Mother Teresa because I know Teresa a lot less, but I think Dorothy was sort of not ever able to escape the people around her, and sort of in that, just, I'm even thinking about in a very different way from Dorothy, but we've had a lot more people around in the last couple of weeks, sort of Corona refugees, and I've just been struck by how in the proximate nature of needing to love and needing to serve and needing to make a lot more meals than normal and watch all the things in this time, how it's sort of like you are struck by the love of God even in the midst of your like endless duties. That are very concrete. So even if you're not necessarily sensing like that divine bliss or peace, I think she often felt just so convinced that if you didn't have that, it didn't quite matter, because God was certainly in the giving of the bread and the breaking of the bread with those right around you. And she's had plenty of those right around her.
That's great. So David Norman asked, Tamar is such an intense name. Do you know more about her reasoning behind the name, or how it may have affected her daughter?
Oh, goodness. I don't know. That's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, there's some debate about just more broadly on kind of the effects of Dorothy's busyness. She was an activist. She was often away from home. It's not unlike a lot of well-respected pastors and others throughout the ages who are wonderful in public and less great in private. I get the sense that she did her absolute best to be a great mother, and Tamar would say that she was a good mother, but at times there was strain in their relationship. But I'm not sure how much the biblical story of Tamar was a part of the naming and or like traumatized Tamar. I don't know. It's a very good question. I've never thought about that before.
There's usually strain, at least some strain in almost every mother-daughter.
Mother-daughter, yes, yes.
So we have a question from an anonymous attendee. How do we fight for justice in this polarized age as inspired by Dorothy Day? Or how do we even understand what justice is?
I mean, I'm going to answer this just in my own small way that has been inspired and given direction by Dorothy's witness, which is, I think whatever your skill set is, you can apply that towards justice. I happen to like words and found myself more in a writing, editing career. I'm trying to channel a publication in my own work to sort of highlight the beauty of I would call it sort of biblical justice. That never also ignores mercy, which I think can sometimes happen, but it doesn't really become real to me. And I don't think it became real to Dorothy until she, at what we would consider great sacrifice, just went all in, and in her case chose a life of voluntary poverty at sort of the height of the Great Depression. And there's sort of I would say, whenever in doubt or feeling paralyzed by the great claims of these noble ideals on our lives, look right around you, and there's likely a way to either take a major risk or there is an act of justice to be done right there in front of you, however seemingly small. And I think she was of the mind that nothing was too small in God's eyes. So again, I just sort of point to the concreteness of that, which in my view, it can cut through some of the polarized definitions of justice, polarized visions of what a just world is. You can't really argue with self-sacrifice.
Along those lines, you had mentioned earlier her personalism. I was hoping maybe you could just sort of define that for everyone listening today and what role that may have played.
Yeah, that's so. Pope John Paul II has some beautiful words on personalism that may have even been a little inspired by Dorothy Day. I feel like I read that somewhere along the way. And I'm not going to have the eloquent definition right here, but it's basically, it's an approach that really values the infinite dignity of the other person, that sees sort of the world's major issues and imbalances of power and imbalances of good and injustice and so on as having a manifestation in the person and people right in front of you. So again, it's a sort of very incarnational way of living. And she, I mean, in some ways, if you read The Catholic Worker and some of the very early editions, she didn't just view a newspaper as an information spray, although ideally, it was that, but it was very much writing for her wasn't, as she once said, it is an act of community. It's a way we minister to others. It's a way we illuminate the context in which others can live and discern and make their decisions. So there's just always an element of, for the good of the other, human beings are an end in and of themselves. And how does love direct every political cause? And I think that's not necessarily defining personalism, but that's often how it manifests. Mm-hmm. People before issues.
So we have an interesting question from Babette Buster, who asked, do you and Cherie think you would have wanted a personal friendship with Dorothy if she were alive today? Would you have welcomed her into her circles?
Would she have welcomed us into her circles or vice versa?
Sounds like vice versa. So you want to go first on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to know Dorothy. I have a feeling, I feel quite intimidated by her. I think she would challenge me to live and sacrifice in ways I have not. I was even feeling on this call like I've so loved her and I have made some real life choices, moves and so on that were like completely inspired by her. But then I get mired back in the complexity of all options and I haven't completely lived that single-minded life that she modeled. So I think I would feel like I would go up to her a little shy, but I would just beg her to be my friend. Yes.
Yes.
Well, I'm not sure she was always easy to be around. I will say that. I think she was a little cantankerous and strong-willed in ways that were not easy on people who so admired her and just wanted to delight her. That's my sense.
You would know far more than I, but Babette, she strikes me as someone that it would be a challenging friendship. It's someone you would probably admire and aspire towards much more than necessarily relate to. And,
right.
But it would probably be a rich but challenging friendship at times. There are people who are so sold out and single-minded that it almost prompts a constant reevaluation of one's own decisions, which is a wonderful thing, but not always a comfortable thing. So
right.
Yeah, she'd be an amazing friend, but it probably wouldn't be really easy. So there's a question from Jenny that says, Anne, if you have time, would you tell us what a beatitudinal faith would look like?
Oh no, I love that question. That's like the heart of everything I, I strive towards. But I don't always know how to answer that. It's one of those things you sort of know it when you see it. I tend to think of when I say the phrase a beatitudinal faith, I'm actually often reflecting more on communities I've seen that have modeled blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the merciful, you can go through them, than necessarily individuals. And maybe that was, I think the Sermon on the Mount was delivered as a communal sermon. I think, what I mean when I instinctively, when I say it when I think of like how to describe it in a nutshell, it's, I'm just really drawn to those people and communities that surprise you with a holiness, with a wisdom, with even a genius that is very rarely honored by the glory of the quote unquote world. So whether that's um, certain kinds of rehabilitation communities that, though they're completely filled with very publicly broken and publicly punished people, model something that the rest of us could learn deeply from, whether it's amazing mutual accountability, whether it's humility and extraordinary hard work to the end of a task, whether it's just like really impressive levels of honesty. So I'm not answering your question very well, but there's something both. I think when I think beatitudinal faith, there's something 1 Corinthians 1 in that for me, weak made strong, like the Beatitudes are so paradoxical, and there's something at odds with the way we think of success and influence, etc., that I'm always looking for subversions of those. And often they seem, then when I look at the Sermon on the Mount, I see some resonance.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question from Renee. What themes should we take from this text and from Dorothy's life to model and follow? And how does her story impact us today?
I think a few things. She was always able to see beauty no matter what the frame was, whether she was in squalor, whether she was hungry, whether people around her were suffering. She had the ability to see someone, extending a hand to someone else in a hidden corner. She believed deeply in giving the homeless the highest quality coffee beans. She just had a whimsical eye for beauty that may not be captured in a Monet painting, but I still take a lot of inspiration and even some delight from. She was naturally grateful. There's just sort of a gratitude that powered her life and orientation that I think we can all learn from, especially right now. I think a lot of us are discovering things to be grateful for that we took for granted 3 weeks ago, that are actually surprisingly profound and can be compass points. And she modeled that. I think there's the fierce sort of consistency of her, even when she didn't feel like it, her commitment to daily sacraments and daily prayer. There was a discipline and a ruggedness to that pursuit that manifested in great fruit, I think, in her life, even if she wasn't always feeling wonderful or in control. That's just sort of bracing and worth paying attention to. Very centered, her life was very centered on daily mass. And she didn't, I think I'm struck by how she rarely expresses the sense of a lightning bolt from God. She never spoke with a certain language of God is leading me here. She really saw, as much as she sought him in private and through the sacrament, she really encountered him in other people, whether it was Peter Morin giving her her perfect vocation, or whether it was just the masses. There's something about, I think, just to encourage those of us who don't always necessarily have a Damascus Road moment, that there's some mysterious presence of God in community, however you can find that, whether right now you're stuck with people right around you, or whether you're seeking communion virtually. There was sort of a humility to very much see thy kingdom come here. How is it manifesting in the here and now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. So we have an interesting question from D.E. Smith, who says, you started to go here, and I'm wondering, how did she see the administration of social justice differently after she became a Christian? And I wonder, what is the motivation for those who aren't Christian?
Well, I will say, I'll start with the end of her life. So her funeral apparently just drew and again, I wish I had these names in front of me, but her funeral drew so many different types of people. And I think people describe going to her funeral and like being shocked by the sort of opponents ideologically and culturally that were there loving her. So that just showed she had this ability to kind of provide, I think I phrased it once, like a container for opposites. That said, including kind of, you know, communists, but yeah, I'm not fluent in all things Marxism, but I think and maybe this is where I started to go and didn't finish there, when she had that like deep frustration at early on in her life at the March Against Hunger. There was, I think in some ways it was as much tonal as it was ideological. She began to react against sort of the deep anger and like all the words and no sense of actual action and personal self-sacrifice that she saw in a lot of her communist friends who were espousing ideals that in the abstract sounded like the just world that she so longed for and that resonated with goodness and truth. But it began to ring hollow. And there's like far smarter people than I who could write a beautiful essay on why a Christian view of justice is different from a pagan one. And I think there is often great overlap, at least in some of the words, but where I think a sort of a godless justice often just involves sort of one power defeating the other, and it doesn't actually progress towards anything. It winds up leading to endless war and mass destruction. A Christian view of justice has a different, because there's forgiveness involved inherently. There's just like, it has a different ending. As you can tell, we need like a real scholar here, but that's what I would say.
I think it's actually profound to have, you know, essentially to call for repentance, but without the offer of redemption. There's a huge difference between social justice initiatives that offer the possibility of redemption and those that don't. Another question comes from an anonymous attendee. Could you talk more about community and how we need time for reflection, quiet, and solitude, but we also need community? How do we strike this balance?
Yeah, welcome to my lifelong struggle, still figuring that one out. I think Dorothy wrestled with this throughout her life. As I said earlier, she, in the sort of throes of communal chaos and noise that she had created and she was committed to, and she felt like was God's reign in the sort of often poorest and dirtiest places imaginable, Christ himself. She's often so longed to get away, and there's many entries of her like racing to her little attic, praying / writing like, oh, I had so many annoyances today, and she'd like go on venting about all of the disturbances that frustrated her, and then she would just pray this contritionary prayer of confession that, oh, I know I shouldn't be feeling these annoyances, and give me strength to engage once again. I know this is your love working out that's going to indeed bless me once I just throw myself back into it. So, you know, I sort of take comfort from the fact that she wrestled with this till the very end. And when she would try to escape completely and do sort of a long contemplative retreat, she really struggled, and she felt useless to the world and felt like her calling was, she was ignoring her calling. And you could argue with that, but I think she just clearly wasn't called to the contemplative life. I don't totally know how to find the balance of it, except in finding time and space with some regularity. And I think they should always be connected, like our times of solitude. And if you're a person of faith, the times of prayer and reading should be for the sake of deep communion with God, but also like a prayer of, you know, how can I be an agent of grace in the community I'm about to enter. And I think the sort of yin and yang of both have to have the other in mind, lead to sort of the greatest freedom, interior freedom when you're in community, but also kind of, I think, grant one's individual solitudinal life still that much more richness. Yeah.
So there's a question, and my apologies in advance to you, dear viewer, if I have mangled your name, but from Hu Lin Chow, who asked, being a person of such high ideals, how did Dorothy deal with the failings in her life, e.g. having a child out of wedlock?
Yeah, I mean, I think she doesn't talk that much about her abortion. It's possible she had two, but we only really know of one prior to having Tamar. And it was followed by a couple suicide attempts, which I think was a product of both the abortion. She was really abandoned by the father of that baby, the aborted baby. So I think it was also just like extraordinary heartbreak and abandonment. And she doesn't talk about it that much. And when she does, really honestly, there's a lot of shame still. I think throughout her life, she never completely lost that. But there is sort of just a prosaic almost acceptance of she was actually really able to accept grace. And she would, there's when you read some of like the profound thing, when you read about her life and all the different profound things that happen, I'm looking for this quote here. She well, actually we may read at the end of the postscript, but there was just sort of like I fell and we were just sitting there and this person came and took, like, there was a sense of God always coming to meet her in her, even in her scars and amazing missteps. So I'm not sure she ever came to peace with some of what we would consider like some of the graver or more costly choices of her early life. But they also perhaps gave her an enormous capacity to see past very imperfect people that she wound up creating endless communities for. So there was also, she was drawn to the gritty and the real, and she probably would have been quite turned off by sort of a domestic prettiness and attractiveness of certain kinds of church pews. There was like a real desire to be in the muck of it all, which no doubt stemmed from her own testimony.
So Greg asked, many of us are isolated right now, but we're also engaged more than ever in technology with Zoom calls like this. How is technology changing us in our relationships? Small question.
Yeah, like the current moment. I mean, I think there's, in general right now, I was struck on I have just had the time of my life leading Comet magazine, and part of that is because it's housed within a broader think tank up in Canada, so I'm the only one in the US, so all my work has largely been virtual. And especially right now, we're starting to have more all staff weekly calls. And the very first call, one of my colleagues just said with great joy on his face, he happens to also be much more technologically savvy than I am. He's like, I'm just so grateful for the technological geniuses that have made this possible. So I am noticing that a lot, that there's actually a lot of thanksgiving suddenly for the ways in which this can keep us connected. And, people connecting with old friends. It's almost like the way we first talked about Facebook, like, oh, I'm connecting with my 5th grade buddy. And I feel like people are doing that now over video call. And they're able to see at least some embodied vocal tone and disposition and imperfection that you can, just as people are in just simple need of one another. But I don't know, we're actually devoting a whole comment article on this question this summer as we look at what this whole crisis has revealed. And I'm not going to be the one to write it, but this may give us, Andy Crouch has this phrase, tech-wise. This whole experience may help us continue to hone the proper ways in which technology allows us to increase individual skill and connect with one another, and learn where to channel it, and then it's sort of like you just asking the basic questions of human flourishing. What enables great connection and what destroys it? And I think we can start to say, these aspects of social media destroy it when channeled in these ways. These aspects of just simple conversation enrich it. And then it's, of course, up to the human being to make the choices, and not be a slave to it, but rather a master of those different ways in which it both enriches and destroys, and ignore the destroy and enhance the enrich.
So we have a long list of questions, but I know time is drawing nigh, so we'll take 2 more. So our penultimate question is from Seth Kaplan, who asks, what can Dorothy Day teach us about submitting ourselves to and compromising our desires for a greater authority?
Oh, wow. Hi, Seth, by the way. That is a very Seth Kaplan question. Can you read it again? It's profound.
What can Dorothy teach us about submitting ourselves to and compromising our desires for a greater authority?
I'm not sure I understand the compromising our desires for. I'd have to see that written down and stare at it for a little bit, Seth. But Dorothy had a very complicated relationship with authority. Her very like obeisance to God ultimately, and in some ways, I would say as a Catholic, she was sort of unusual in the intimacy with which she expressed her relationship with God at the time in her era. That her rooting there made her quite suspicious of a lot of other worldly authorities, including church authorities. So there was a deep tension between her one sense of like ultimate authority and her sense of being obedient to the state, which she often was not. She created a lot of enemies in the 40s when she was so committed to, in some ways, a more Anabaptist commitment around pacifism that she just was very against this war, which of course many people thought was perfectly just, and got arrested many times in her life for different forms of civil disobedience. So I guess the only way I'd reconcile this is to say, and this was the radical part of her, and we're not all radicals, but there is a way to order a singular surrender and a singular just decision to, if insofar as you can trust your discernment of God's voice, to then direct every other relationship with every other authority, civil and otherwise, that is out there. And unfortunately, not all of us are all that discerning, and it's arguable Dorothy wasn't always that discerning. She would probably say she made plenty of mistakes. But I think keeping that sequence properly ordered is one way of answering your question.
So the last question from our viewers, what is the biggest challenge that Dorothy presents to us today?
I think she was just really uncompromising. So there was the Dorothy that you would meet, for all the ways in which in some ways her public voice and her private voice, the older that she got, somewhat diverged in terms of she was very wrestling in private and much more sort of solid and convicted in public. If I were to meet her in a soup kitchen, on the page, in an interview on television, and even at mass, I think you would see the same person, and that was because she didn't nuance her choices morally. She really believed, like, her call, I'm not sure she would say everyone's call, but was to live with the poor, with everything that would come with that, sacrifice everything, or all sort of material possessions. And there was a purity and a radicalism to her life that I continually find myself wondering, should I go in that same direction? So it's never quite reconciled for me. So I think I would feel there are aspects to my own life that I can't justify in the face of hers. That's my sort of honest answer.
And thank you for so gracefully handling a blizzard of questions.
Thank you for this.
In a moment, I'm going to ask you to sort of close us out by reading the postscript from the reading. But before we go there, I just wanted to thank all of you who could join us. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is really an experiment. This is our fledgling attempt. We so appreciate just your grace and your attention in joining us today. We would really covet your comments too. You'll be receiving a survey almost immediately after this is over, and we'd love your input on how we make this even more valuable and encouraging to you as we are all social distancing. We anticipate doing a number of events like this, and in fact, our next event will be Wednesday at 7 p.m., where Trinity Forum will partner with Baylor University in hosting Cornell West, Rob V. George, and Hamza Youssef to discuss communities in Corona and what we can learn. In addition to our bigger conversations, we'd love your input about whether you would be interested in participating in smaller, more intimate reading groups on the Long Loneliness or other Trinity Forum readings online, and if you'd be interested in hosting those. And if you could indicate that, we'd really appreciate that input. I'd also just like to thank my crackerjack colleagues at the Trinity Forum, Alyssa Abraham, Hannah Smith, and Callie Walker. Hannah Smith in particular very quickly transitioned from becoming our events coordinator to our video producer extraordinaire. So my colleagues have had to be very nimble and handling new challenges, and just deeply grateful for them. As we close, and as you know, the last portion of text in Dorothy Day's The Long Loneliness is this beautiful postscript that Dorothy wrote, in describing the way that, in many ways, grace unfolded in her life and her vocation for justice just unfolded in her life. And I thought it'd be a lovely way to close us out if you could read that for all of us.
Sure, I'd love to. This is Dorothy. She writes, "We were just sitting there talking when Peter Morin came in. We were just sitting there talking when lines of people began to form saying, 'We need bread.' We could not say, 'Go, be thou filled.' If there were 6 small loaves and a few fishes, we had to divide them. There was always bread. We were just sitting there talking and people moved in on us. Let those who can take it, take it. Some moved out and that made room for more. And somehow the walls expanded. We were just sitting there talking and someone said, 'Let's all go live on a farm.' It was as casual as all that, I often think. It just came about. It just happened. I found myself a barren woman, the joyful mother of children. It is not always easy to be joyful, to keep in mind the duty of delight. The most significant thing about the Catholic worker is poverty, some say. The most significant thing is community, others say. We are not alone anymore. But the final word is love. At times it has been, in the words of Father Zosima, a harsh and dreadful thing, and our very faith in love has been tried through fire. We cannot love God unless we love each other, and to love we must know each other. We know him in the breaking of bread, and we know each other in the breaking of bread, and we are not alone anymore. Heaven is a banquet, and life is a banquet too, even with a crust where there is companionship. We have all known the long loneliness, and we have learned that the only solution is love, and that love comes with community. And it all happened while we sat there talking, and it is still going on."
Anne, thank you so much for joining us today. And to all of you listening and watching, thank you so much. We covet your comments, and we so appreciate your time. Good day.